Alright, hello everyone. I'm back again with another tutorial, and this one's going to be about modeling workflows. Now, this might seem obvious to some people, but I'm not sure if everyone knows these methods or not. Essentially, it's just um, food for thought when you're starting on a character or model, just different ways of thinking. These are just the different methods that I used as I progressed through my practices. I started off with box modeling, moved on to patch modeling, and then working with sculpt meshes. I'll elaborate on each of those very soon. So the first box modeling is essentially you start with a primitive. It doesn't have to be a cube, even though it's called box modeling. You could start with a cylinder or a sphere. Anyway, I'm working in Maya here, and I have a cube, which I just have I've duplicated for symmetry. Yeah, you can do that differently in different applications. Really, the software doesn't matter in this case. It's just more of the theory. So when you're working with a cube or a primitive to start, uh, box modeling is essentially you have to start with something basic, and then you just add divisions, and as you add divisions, you can start building up more and more detail. So say, now I can start making this look a little bit more round, for instance. Or if I were to cut it this way and here, and then say I take this face here and extrude it, say this is a face now. Sorry, hold on. I had reflection on, which was affecting my extrusion there, and say, okay, yeah, that's a nose. Now, you would obviously do this slower, um, and I guess I wouldn't really go into the nose right away like that. I'd try to get the more structure of the head first. But that brings me into kind of the pros and cons, and I'll go through the pros and cons of each method. But here, the good thing is, like, okay, you have something to work with. You're not working from nothing. Um, you can easily see the shape building, and you can see the whole silhouette, and you can start low and build up. But if you're not careful, then you start getting some really busy areas and some empty areas. You kind of have to work everywhere evenly. It's a theory that's the same throughout all the different methods, but specifically here, if you start dividing too early, you're gonna have problems. Um, you you sorry. You don't want to end up saying, okay, well, I want to get this eye here, and then you end up adding cuts, and without thinking about it, oh, you can say, oh yeah, I build an eye here. Um, I don't know, this is not, obviously, I'm not trying to make something awesome here, but you build an eye, and then you have this extra cut in the nose now, and if you were to leave this build up, all of a sudden you'd have a bunch of cuts in the nose that you haven't dealt with, and then you'd have to try to line them up, and you'd end up getting some pretty wobbly surfaces. But that's just something to think about in terms of box modeling and building it up like that. The second method that I learned was patch modeling, which I liked for a very long time and I used for a very long time. So that is essentially starting with different segments or an individual face and then combining parts together. So here, there we go. Again, I'm working with faces, but you can do this for anything really. But one thing I'd also want to point out is I like to put the eye in there first. I'd have like an image plane or something, and then I try to line it up. But what you do is you build different segments. So, for instance, the mouth, the beginnings of the nose, the eye, etc. So you have to figure out like how you're going to make each piece, and then you can combine them together. For instance, the eye, you could start with a cylinder, which is how I would always do it. Is I'd start with a cylinder, and not too many subdivision levels. Six for say, right? And what you do is you take that cylinder and there we go, just delete all the triangles there, and you end up with this cylinder which is already the beginnings of the eye shape, for instance, or the mouth. So you'd place that there, and then once you have it there, you could go into side view and select your vertices. There we go. Yeah, so here's my side view, and then you'd have an image in the background, and you could just line this up with whatever image you have. Since I already have an edge loop here, I could say, oh yeah, I'm just going to work that in there like that. And then once you have built a segment, you'd take the outer loop, for instance, and then you'd extrude it out, and you'd start making your edge loops and build that together. You'd do the same for the mouth. In other cases, for instance the nose, you would start with an individual plane. So before I had this, I'd just delete this here. So I'd have, oh yeah, here's just the one plane. And then in the side view, you could just extrude it, and just kind of follow the bridge of the nose. If you don't have a picture, it doesn't really matter. Like, you can try to get the nose shape without it, but I find a picture in the back often helps, even if it's a drawing you made yourself. So yeah, as you'd go through that, you'd have this, and then you'd have more segments, you know, and then you'd bridge the parts together. So say I have these two segments, I'd combine them together, and then I'd say here, and just bridge those together. Or I would bridge those together, but the bridging tool doesn't seem to want to work right now. There. Yeah, so you just bridge those together. So the pro to this is you have a lot of control. It's if you start doing more high detail in one area, it's not going to destroy you. You can build up the other areas first before combining them together. That way you don't have to worry about a clutter of faces. That being said, you still want to keep in mind that you want to avoid building up too much detail in one area before getting to other areas, because then it starts getting hard to figure out how things fit together. So those are both good methods, and you can work with them either way. Sorry, you can do either or, but at the same time you could use them together and do this in some areas. So eventually I ended up reaching the point where I do this just for faces because I liked having the control and it was easy to follow my reference images. But then for the body, it was just a lot faster to work with a box or a cylinder or something like that. For instance, for the torso, you'd start with a cube and then you just make that shape. But I found the face was nicer to work with patches. That being said, it's a much slower process, and it's not something you would often think of doing in a production environment because it just would take you a very long time. Which leads me to the last method that I want to talk about, which is using a sculpt mesh. Now, a sculpt mesh, oops, sorry. Okay, yeah, sculpt mesh. You essentially have, it doesn't have to be very good. It just has to have, if it's a character, for instance, it just has to have arms or legs or the basic shape. But you want to have some nice even spacing. And this would be brought into a 3D sculpting program, and then you would build the details from there. So I'm just going to pull up ZBrush just as an example. So in terms of a box mesh or a base mesh, You don't necessarily have to make that in Maya either. Like for instance, this was made directly in ZBrush, and I just created parts based off of like spheres and things like that that I just stretched into place. Afterwards, once you have the shape you want, you can just combine the parts together. Yeah, and then you just build it up, but you'll notice that the geometry is pretty crummy. Let me go down a level here. Yeah, it's because it's higher density. It's hard to tell, but it's not a very good mesh. And then eventually you'd eventually have to retopologize it, which is rearranging the polygons, but you'd have a surface to work from. So say I'm just going to do this in ZBrush, but you can do this anywhere you want in other tools as well. The Z-sphere here. There we go. And topology. No, sorry, rigging. Select mesh. Edit. Oops. Edit. There we go. And what you do is you just go in and recreate your topology one square at a time. But if you do it in other software, you can get away with other tools that'll help you create nice topology. Even here, you can miss a few polygons and it'll fill in the area. But once you start getting it, you can preview and stuff like that. Yeah. So you just build up your topology, and eventually you end up with your final topology, which is much cleaner. So you have the edge loops that follow the form, like in my previous video. You have contours there. I ended up putting a little more density in the end in the arms, just so that you could bend the elbows and things. But it's just to get the idea right. If you're still planning on sculpting on this, which at the time I was, you would want to have more even spacing polygons so you can still do your sculpting. And then later on you can add those extra divisions so that it can be animated properly. In terms of flaws with this, I don't see many, because you can create your basic sculpt. You don't even have to worry about topology. This is maybe not the best example, but you can just create whatever you want fast. You can get a design out. So this is my current favorite way to work. However, I guess there is one downside. Well, it's not really a downside. It's in terms of creating an animatable mesh. This doesn't really give you that. This is more going to give you the concept or the design of it, and then you have to go through a lot of work to make a animatable version of it. The retopology process that I just kind of skimmed over there is one way you could do it, but other times you might just recreate the model entirely from scratch using box modeling or patch modeling. Either way, these are all just different ways you can work. If you want to know more about it, you can either ask in the comments, or there's plenty of information online. I essentially just wanted to introduce different workflows so that you know what to look for, and that's more of the point, really. It's trying to introduce people or get people started, as opposed to doing individual little things. Maybe in the future I'll start doing more specific things based off of requests and things like that. And I would also like to do some more, sculpts or paints and things like that. I'll just put up time lapses and whatnot, just to show more of a workflow as opposed to just a straight up tutorial. Either way, I hope this helped, and until next time.